Okay, thank you.
All right, my apologies. Good afternoon and welcome. This is panel 2A, and the title of the panel is called Playing the Card, Introducing Critical Race to Media Literacy Education. I am the panel moderator, Dr. Jayne Cubbage, and I am joining you today from Bowie State University in the state of Maryland. And before we get underway, of course, I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists who are joining us today before diving into our topic. We have Mr. Alan Berry and Dr. Judith Rosenbaum Andre, both of the University of Maine. And the title of their presentation is Critical Race Media Literacy and Fake News, Reframing and Teaching News Literacy in a Racialized Society. Also joining us is Dr. Kimberly Moffitt of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And the title of her presentation is Exploring Colorism with a Critical Race Media Literacy Lens. Also joining us is Dr. Wendy Weinhold of Coastal Carolina University, whose presentation was titled Teaching Late Night Literacy, Saturday Night Live, Satire and Media Education. And then last but not least is Dr. Gordon Alley Young of Kingsborough County Community College, part of the CUNY system, whose presentation is titled Of Marines and of Mercy, Critically Reading Racial Discourses from the 2017 French Presidential Election. Now, before we get into hearing from our panelists and doing our roundtable of discussions, what I want to do is establish a definition of critical race media literacy before we go on. Yes, we are playing the quote unquote race card, the critical race media literacy card. And we know that we are in tempestuous and racialized times. Yet, if we look at the overview of this country, this historical perspective of this country in the United States specifically, we know that race was always central to our existence here in a place called America. And so when we consume media, as we know, it is very difficult to avoid the discussion of race. Yet, when we look at the media literacy movement and media literacy scholarship, race is something that is often sidestepped. It has been absent from the conversation at large. And so accordingly, we use or talk about critical race media literacy because of the centrality of race in everyday life and media messages, and in order to decolonize media education, as we talked about in many conferences today in our opening session, as well as in other panels, the path forward to that process of decolonization includes understanding the persistent racialized themes and stereotypes, the charged messaging, which socializes audiences and their place in society and the world. And of course, these messages are known to reinforce the ideologies of the status quo. So to empower media audiences, particularly in educational settings, race can no longer be left off the table. And it is imperative that media educators and scholars alike look at or examine ways in which media is used to further divide members of society while providing stereotypical trope and fodder, and at the same time fostering xenophobia and pervasive racial strife as we see today. So that said, critical race media literacy is officially defined by Agodzo from 2016 and USO 2002 as a concept which merges media literacy, critical media literacy, and critical race theory. Critical race media literacy fuses the themes of race and critical analysis to the discussion of media literacy in all levels of education. Geraldo from 2010 posits that critical race media literacy is apt for incorporation into media education in today's race-based society and in our media-saturated environment. And then Brooks, 2006, states that while race is a social, man-made human construct, it does, in its application in all levels of society, hold material implications that result in stigmatization of physical characteristics and land of origin and native tongue. So it is a reality, though in many cases we sort of dance between it's not real, it is, or it isn't. So accordingly, critical race media literacy can assist both educator and student alike in identifying embedded themes of media, which basically impact the impression of identified races and cultures, while at the same time providing necessary insight into media processes. And so this process is designed to empower and liberate audiences as we all analyze, access, analyze, evaluate, produce, and act upon media messages. And so, without any further ado, we want to begin our roundtable discussion, which essentially will ask each panelist to talk about their topic briefly, and then we will get into a series of questions before opening up the floor to any of our audience members who would like to ask questions or add any insights into this topic. And so why don't we start with one question? I'm going to stop my screen share. Start with a question to the panelists, and we'll go in order of presentation. So that would be Alan and Judith going first, and then Kimberly next, and then Wendy, and then Gordon. So in that order, we'll ask about 4 questions and then open it up to our assembled audience members if they would like to weigh in and talk about some of our issues. Again, before we get started, I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you for joining our panel today. We know that you have many choices for the conference, and so thank you for joining us with this panel. So we hope that you find yourself enlightened and empowered in this space. So the first question I want to ask is, tell us, this is to our panelists, about your topic, and explore briefly how you came to be interested in your topic and what you hope to achieve with your research related to race. And so this can be addressed by all the panelists, but Alan and Judith can start first, can lead us off.
Hi everyone. Thanks for coming. My name is Alan Berry. I'm here with Judith Rosenbaum. We're both from the University of Maine. I mean, we've been interested in the topic of news literacy because we've been collaborating on some news literacy projects at the University of Maine. My background is in media literacy. Judith's research background is in media literacy as well. So we come at it with a rich background in media literacy education and understanding of critical media literacy and other things. And then I think Jayne actually put out a call for book chapters, which kind of sparked our interest in kind of reconceptualizing the news literacy education that we were doing to incorporate critical race theory. And it's something that we'll talk about later with the next question, but it's something that we saw as news literacy education kind of, it's happening more frequently, which is a good thing, but something that we found problematic in the news literacy education that we were seeing is that it's being filtered through fake news narratives, which essentially presents news as a binary, that there is fake news and that there's real news, which for us is antithetical to critical race or critical media literacy, which recognizes all media as constructions and all media as subjective in both its construction and interpretation. And what we are thinking of in terms of fusing critical media literacy and critical race theory was that fake news could be reconceptualized to include the misrepresentation of marginalized communities, which for so-called legitimate news or legacy news has a historical legacy in misrepresenting marginalized communities and the stereotyping of marginalized communities, also the overrepresentation of those communities in terms of negative stories like crime, also the underrepresentation of those communities in positive news coverage as well. So that's kind of what we were thinking in terms of our project and our research. Judith, I don't know if you want to add anything to that or?
Sure. Sure. Hi, so I'm Judith. I am also at the University of Maine. And it's really interesting because Alan and I have actually been teaching several workshops on fake news and news literacy. And the discussion we always had with our main collaborator, our subject librarian at the University, Jayne, is there such thing as real news or true news? And I think the biggest issue facing the field of news literacy is that it has become reductionist in that it looks at to what degree does the news meet these objective journalistic standards. Then when you marry that to the notion of fake news, it becomes a very dichotomous approach, as in this is true, this is fake, and we're no longer looking at, yes, but what about the consistent misrepresentation? And another issue we see with current news literacy programs, including ours, is that major mainstream publications like the New York Times, like CBS News, those big big conglomerates are presented as somehow the golden standard. And so we're completely ignoring the fact that they marginalize, misrepresent, and stereotype people from marginalized groups. And so what we've done is we've created a new understanding of fake news to include this misrepresentation and to address issues of power and privilege that will hopefully make news literacy programs more critical.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you both. Kimberly, Moffitt, please have us talk to us a little bit about your topic and how you came to envision it as being helpful in the discussion of race and critical media literacy, critical race media literacy.
Sure. So I've been working in this area that I often refer to as Black hair and body politics for most of my academic career. And but I'm also a media studies scholar, so always looking to find ways to blend these two aspects of who I am as a researcher together. And so I have been working in the area specifically around colorism most recently, and decided to utilize critical race media literacy to give us a chance to investigate further, in particular, how young people are dealing with this whole notion of there being this inscribed privilege of those that have lighter hued skin than others, and that with those privileges become a certain way of life that is extended to some that isn't necessarily extended to others. And I recognize even more so that the media play a significant role in perpetuating that notion. And with that, and certainly with teenagers, knowing and recognizing how often they're utilizing media, in particular social media, I decided to find a way to blend these two together. And so my project really is looking at groups of Black girls who are teenagers. They're middle school and high schoolers that we conducted focus groups with, asking them to explore specifically how they look at this whole notion of colorism. And we did this by having them watch an episode entitled Black Like Me, which was in the series Blackish. And then afterwards, we had conversations to really try and get a sense of what they were thinking about specific to this notion, but then also asking them to find ways to express what they were feeling, because at the core of critical race media literacy, of course, is about empowering while also informing and educating. And so we were looking for ways to have conversations for the girls to be able to come out of this session feeling more empowered about whatever particular skin that they were in, and not feeling as though they needed to ascribe to so much of what gets perpetuated in the media or in their families or in among their peers, in reference to who is better based on a particular skin hue. And so really for me, this is about raising, this topic is personal to me, but it's also an academic research area, because it is vital that we're having conversations about ways to raise awareness to a very known secret among a number of communities of color, but yet we pretend as though it's something that doesn't have a direct impact on the self-esteem, self-worth, and self-being of many children of color, when in fact what we know, and certainly anecdotally what I learned, is as I'm teaching my college students, and in undergrad in particular, that you can still see that they're working through and trying to grasp what they've experienced as young people around this notion of colorism, and feeling as though they have to relearn how to appreciate themselves and to embody who they really are because of so many of the messages that they received at a much younger age. And so critical race media literacy does a fabulous job of being able to give us a framework that allows us to talk about ways to empower communities of color as they're engaging the media. And in my personal stance, hoping to get young people, in particular teenagers, to embrace who they are fully without allowing media messages to dictate that for them.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. Next, we have Wendy. Tell us again your experiences with your topic and what you hope to achieve and explore surrounding this topic of critical race media literacy with your research.
Thanks so much, Jayne. It's such a wonderful opportunity to get to be here with all of you. My interest in Saturday Night Live as a teaching tool stems back to 2015 and the United States presidential election. And I'm actually a journalism scholar and also a gender scholar. And the election made me crazy, but I knew I needed to study it because I had such strong feelings about it. And SNL was my pathway to study with sanity. But the problem was that as I watched SNL, while it made me feel good, it also didn't do what I needed it to do. And I was really interested in exploring the ways that race and gender eventually, as they came out and as my research turned to looking at Me Too and looking at Black Lives Matter, how it was that we could look to the ways that SNL, as an institution of media itself, speaks to issues of critical race media literacy, issues of intersectionality, issues of institutional and ideological power, ways that these various sort of constructs shape our ideas of race and offer students opportunities to talk about race that may often make them quite uncomfortable. And so I really found that SNL ended up being this place where I could constantly use teaching tools via SNL sketches to get my students to talk about things, particularly in relationship to communication theory and a variety of moments that they weren't always willing to really talk about deeply. And I found that as I particularly started to teach areas of rhetoric and standpoint theory and Kimberly Crenshaw's ideas of intersectionality, all of these ideas of satire as a corrective of the way that we can really see that our ways of seeing can also be challenged to move into different ways of seeing, were really ways that SNL, this space where on the one hand it's just easy to laugh, could also be a space where we can look really deeply at moments of power and privilege, moments of intersecting identities, and call out our attention on things that often get sort of swept aside. I just used an SNL sketch from Matt Damon's appearance in December of 2018, this hilarious sketch where he's an ornament from Good Will Hunting who gets put on the back of the Christmas tree with a number of other sort of miserable ornaments, to talk about all of these different levels of institutional and intersectional power and privilege. And it has often given me the salve that my soul really needs. So it's lovely getting to be here and talking with all of you about it.
Wonderful, wonderful. Next is Gordon Ali Young. Please tell us what you hope to explore and how you wanted to use your research in order to advance or explore this topic more deeply, critical race media literacy.
Just really quickly, I got into this research because several years ago, around 2004, I started doing research on France changing its laws. It's changing its laws on what they would call laïcité, which is roughly translated to secularism. They were putting in a number of initiatives in France at the time whereby they were banning headscarves in school, not just headscarves, it was called the headscarf law but by the press, but anything that you could put on your body, any chain, any sort of religious symbol or clothing was banned from school for teachers and students, that is publicly funded schools. And so I got into that and I actually started teaching in American schools about what is the introducing them to this idea of can we subject people to this in schools, and what are the outcomes of this, what are the possible social effects of this. And a lot of the American students I shared this with are like, oh my God, this this sort of xenophobia, this sort of nationalism could never take hold here. A lot of college students would tell me that. We were in the George Bush years then in 04 to 06, 04 to 08, sorry. And then we had sort of a respite with the Obama years where it was a much more sort of enlightened period of time in terms of race, not a post-race era as some journalists would say, but certainly one where it was more introspective about race. So I am a French speaker. I speak French as a second language very badly, and so I like to always practice my French. And I like to practice with short videos, and that brought me to the French presidential campaign, which I was aware of already, but I got really taken by some of the political videos, specifically one by Marine Le Pen, who is the head of a party called the National Front in France, which has a history of being a racist, xenophobic, and anti-Semitic party. And she was the daughter of a lifelong leader of this party who came in, and she was supposed to be the next wave to represent a sea change and take this party and make it not xenophobic, not racist, not all these things, and sort of give it an image makeover. What I found was that the same messages were still there. You know, the same messages 2.0 of her father were still there, of the old party. But it had gotten more intelligent, you know. And so what I did was I took her campaign videos and I analyzed them for how they managed to speak in a racist way without ever including people of color. It was all very indirect. It was all very implied. It used a lot of shadow. Like, so I talk about people of color in those videos being represented by shadows and absences and gaps. It's a really interesting thing for me to explore in this way, because what I hope to develop from this is to sort of track how this sort of rhetoric changes over time. I think it's interesting how we're going through a period of coronavirus right now, and I tend to think of these isms and these phobias like the coronavirus. They're designed to be sort of replicating, and they're also designed to sort of modify themselves once you sort of pinpoint them and corner them. They're designed to find new ways to sort of infect minds and sort of perpetuate themselves. And so I'm finding the ways that, you know, if this racism that's being spread by political parties like the National Front would be a virus, I think it would be coronavirus. It would be like one of those viruses that once you develop a cure for it, it's going to find a new manifestation. It's going to find a new way to infect, a new way to sort of inflame. And so that's really been interesting for me, exploring that through a new frame, especially in this year where we've been under lockdown.
Excellent. Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. So in the next round of questioning, what I want to explore more explicitly is, what is the benefit? Now, we live in a racialized world where race is sort of at the forefront of most people's minds, even if we sort of sidestep it and ignore it on some level. And so when we come to the table and talk about critical race or critical media literacy, and then we want to add or incorporate race into that discussion, what I want to hear from each of you is, what is the benefit of adding this? Because in reality, on some level, there must have been some unspoken edict that there wasn't a benefit to address this topic directly. And so as such, now we're moving into that place of starting to address it, but somewhere along the line, it must have been decided or just subconsciously ignored that we don't want to talk about race. We just want to sort of just do media literacy. And so in your estimations and from your experience, what is the benefit of adding race to critical media literacy in an educational setting? And we can start off with Alan and Judith first.
Start. So before coming to the University of Maine, I did media literacy work in New York City. And working across the boroughs of New York City, two things usually came up when we talked about news and my work with communities of color, and that's either they did not see their reality represented in news, that they did not recognize their community as presented in news coverage, or they internalized it and thought that that's all their community was or could be. So for me, that has to be central to media literacy and news literacy education. But then coming to Maine, a state that is largely rural, largely white, I did not see those conversations happening in these kinds of spaces, in these learning spaces, either in libraries or in K through 12 education, or even at the University of Maine. And then of course, we also saw news literacy kind of being colonized by these fake news narratives and kind of being filtered through that binary of real news and fake news, which kind of positions fake news outside, and misinformation, disinformation outside of mainstream news. But as communities of color could tell you, those things have always been present in news in this country. And critical race theory shows us that news is generally constructed as white. And I think that's an important perspective to understand when we're thinking about news. And when we start to think about news from that perspective, obviously doesn't let mainstream news or legacy news kind of escape our critical examination. It brings that into these discussions, which I think is positive. It also allows us to understand that news news media are choices, that there are being choices made from at every stage, from the conception of news to the production of news to the reception of news. We're always making choices, and those choices often leave out voices. That's a lot of stories, a lot of voices are not heard in the news, don't get a chance to express themselves in the news as well, in the construction of news. And that people experience these news stories differently as they interpret them in their own lives. And in terms of working with white students and rural students in Maine, I mean, some of these, I mean, Jayne said that this is on the forefront of people's mind. A lot of these students, it's not on the forefront of their mind. I mean, I have students who if this subject comes up in a classroom, they'll say, well, I've never seen this. I've never seen this happen. I don't see race. I don't see racism in my community. So they're not thinking about this, and in asking them to kind of think about this and doing it through news literacy education, I think is kind of it's a good starting point. And we can talk about some of the activities after with the other question though too. I don't know if Judith wants to jump in.
Yeah, so I have a somewhat similar, but also kind of different from Alan. I came to the University of Maine 3 years ago after having spent 10 years at the unsinkable Albany State University in Georgia, which is a historically Black college university. So for 10 years, I taught probably 99% African-American students, and teaching media literacy or media literacy based courses at an HBCU makes race just an inexorable part of what you're talking about. Like Alan said so beautifully, you know, the misrepresentation is rampant. And so teaching a class full of African-American students, well, but this is real and this is fake. And they say, but there's so many stereotypes. And you realize that's the crux of what we need to be teaching students, is the stereotyping, the misrepresentation, and the way in which white people are socialized. And it's really funny because when I was in Georgia, I used to actually use Maine and North Dakota as an example. Like, imagine if people in Maine see this show, what are they going to think about African Americans? And here I am in Maine, and it does actually work that way. So to me, news literacy cannot exist outside of critical race theory. It's not a thing in my world. And on that highly academic note, I will pass it on to the others.
Thank you both. Thank you. Kimberly, what are your thoughts about this question? What is the benefit? How can this benefit your educational settings?
Yeah, I want to first say that when I think of critical media literacy, I already think about the role that race plays in it. I don't think it's even possible for us to talk about anything being critical without including issues of race in it. I do think that in the instance of utilizing a framework that adds the term race, makes it explicit, and it needs to be made explicit because otherwise other scholars and others who are engaging in media literacy tasks don't necessarily incorporate or recognize the significance of race as a part of the conversation. And so that's why we see the notion of saying critical race media literacy, but in fact, anything that is critical in any of our research has to deal with these particular areas that are considered outside of the norm, whether that is, you know, gender, sexual orientation, social economic status, geographic location, and ethnicity. All of those things become a part of a conversation that has anything to do with that which is critical. But again, I understand why there's a need for us to add this piece in to make sure we are having the conversations that center the conversation on race and make sure we understand the significance of it. I would also think, from my perspective, the benefit of including this is very much about teaching young people. And again, this may have something to do about the particular space I'm in my career, where I have teenagers and I'm reflecting often on how they are interacting and engage in media and thinking about them as future media consumers and what that'll look like. And I want to make sure that we see media for what it is, that it's a business that is set specifically to generate money and capital. And in order to do so, they have to play towards audiences that will continue to support them. And so with that, just to the point that both Alan and Judith have already raised, issues of representation come up and come up quite often. And so how are we going to engage dealing with these representations that don't reflect fully the communities that are being talked about in media, but are certainly pervasive in how we've decided to craft what those particular groups look like? And so from my vantage point, critical race media literacy is giving us the space and time to have those conversations and to push back on those representations, and to also give, in particular, young people a chance to understand in full context the role that media plays in their lives and how they can still engage media, but be able to be critical about what they're engaging so that it doesn't end up dictating how they then see themselves in the end.
Absolutely. Yes, yes, aptly stated. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kimberly. Wendy is next, and would you please give your thoughts on this topic? What is the benefit of adding critical race media literacy to educational settings? What would you say?
So I think it's really important, echoing all the things that my colleagues have already said, to really emphasize and get students thinking about the ways that they are part of the commodity audience, that they are being sold particular ideologies, they're being sold particular stereotypes. And SNL offers me that particular teaching tool to get people to get students to see the ways that they're encouraged to laugh at whiteness, to laugh at stereotypes about Blackness, about Asian experience, about women, about all kinds of different identities, rather than actually confront the realities and the ways that people in power and privilege, the ways that people who are media owners and corporations benefit from the continued upholding of those stereotypes. So what I really am interested in doing with my students via critical media race literacy is getting them to think about a political economy approach to evaluating media, and to think about the ways that their identities, that the particular intersectional moments really offer opportunities for us to critique the institutions that work through hegemony to hold us back. I don't want to take up much more time than that because it's such a lovely conversation, but I couldn't echo more what's already been said.
Yes, yes, thank you so much. Thank you. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And Gordon, what are your thoughts on the benefit of adding critical race media literacy to education?
Yeah, I must say I'm coming at this as someone who's been trained in media and mass communications through my education, but I ended up teaching at a school that's largely speech communication, where we focus a lot on the human act. So I've had to find clever ways to sort of incorporate this. I think the media is always present, and critical literacy of the media is a must. And I agree so much with the last speaker that you cannot separate critical media literacy from the question of race, absolutely. It's interesting, I'm teaching often a group of students who now more so than ever in the past are using media to represent themselves and even speak for them, at the same time that they're not necessarily always critically interrogating those messages. So I sort of view my role as what my mother always wanted me to be. She always wanted me to be a medical doctor. So I sort of like to metaphoricalize my role as doctor professor as, I want to inoculate using critical media literacy, and specifically one that emphasizes being critical about media portrayals of race. I want to use that to inoculate the students a little bit, so that when they go out into the world, they're not going to catch a bit of this infection of ism, racism, ageism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, whatever it is. It's not a cure-all like any sort of vaccine. I'm going here with the vaccine metaphor again, but it's I think we need to be able to expose students like we would vaccinate them. Like now we're emptying our schools to protect our students physically. We also want to protect their belief, attitude, value systems as well, in the same way that we would protect their bodies, right? So when we're in the classroom with them, rather than just sort of talking at them, allowing them to interact with texts and sort of show how those texts are just watered down versions of racism that have had many proliferations, right? It gives them a bit of defense that when they then go and use media to speak for them, or use media to represent themselves, or actually produce their own media, it gives them a bit more defense against the racism that inherently always creeps in. You know, one thing that strikes me when I was preparing for this, as I was thinking about my experience teaching ESL students, you know, sometimes students who had just had a couple weeks on the ground in the US, you know, had been put into a program to sort of advance their language skills and get them to be fluent speakers of English. And so one of the things we would do with them is I was responsible for teaching them digital video making so that we could get them to do like what an essay would do, but use digital video to do it. And I found that, you know, through so many of their videos, they were talking about race a lot of the time, but they didn't even see it. They didn't even realize it. One young woman, she was from Russia. She literally won the green card lottery. And so that was first part of her story, how I won the lottery and how I came to the United States. And then she shows images of, one of the images that grabbed everyone and they laughed when they saw it. She said, I made all kinds of new friends. And then she showed her a picture of herself sitting next to an African-American man who appeared to be homeless and was sleeping on a park bench, you know. So everyone laughed at that point. So after the video, we talked about, you know, how much it was a conversation about race in the United States, and they looked at me like I was crazy. But, you know, we ended up talking about how so often the media presents Black bodies as though they're these immobilized things that don't speak for themselves, but other people speak for them, like in these inhumane ways. And all we had to do was just sort of get the ball rolling, and, you know, it was there. It just had to be teased out. You know, it was interesting. And those are the types of moments that make me realize that we need to be doing this kind of work a lot more, because the conversations are difficult, they're uncomfortable, but they're so necessary in order for us to move forward as a society, and to stop replicating the images of subjugation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gordon. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. So we have one more round of questions that I want to pose to our panelists before we open it up to the audience. And by way of posing your questions, if you have questions you want addressed, please pose them in the chat. And so when we finish this next round of questioning, next and final round of questionings, we'll be able to possibly address some of your questions that you may have, so you can weigh in on this important topic. The final question for the panelists is, give an example of how, or specific strategies that you use to employ this topic, to incorporate it. So what do you do in a classroom educational setting? How do you incorporate this? How is it, some of you are saying that it's central, yet even if you're talking about critical media literacy, you do have to sort of bring the discussion to front and center, say, we're going to talk about race. And you may say, well, how is this framed, or how you might want to introduce this topic to your students particularly. You may employ various strategies. And so that's what I'm curious about for this round of questioning. And we can start off again with Judith and Alan, if you would. What specific strategies do you use to employ this topic?
Yeah, so I'll talk about a strategy that we used in our last round of our news literacy program, and we're replicating it again this year for Media Literacy Week. Is we had our participants actually take a news story and construct a headline and choose a photo to go along with that, to go along with the facts of that story for a specific news outlet. So Fox News, MSNBC, Huffington Post, Breitbart, et cetera. And then discuss that. But we wanted it to kind of focus the conversation that we were going to have around that, around race, around ideas of race. So we gave them a story about racial profiling. And this was last year, and this was obviously very current in the news. It still is current in the news and always is current in the news, but it was especially salient at that time. So they had to take a story of racial profiling, take the facts, and then construct it, and it made them start thinking about how different news outlets make choices around stories of race and stories of communities of color, and then also thinking about how they as audiences also make choices and interpret those stories and those narratives, and thinking about what voices get left out, what voices get privileged in those stories as well. Judith, did I cover that, or?
Yes, yeah, and it was a really interesting activity to take on with the students, because one group actually said, so this was a story about, and you might have heard about it, it was a Black mother and her daughter were refused entry to the community pool by the HOA president, I guess, who demanded they show their card because he didn't believe they lived in the neighborhood. And one group said, yeah, we decided to not cover any of the racial aspects because we wanted to stay neutral and we have to be objective, right? So they tried to embody this notion of journalistic objectivity. And other groups actually called them out saying, yes, but you are ignoring narratives of privilege, of power, of systemic racism, of marginalization. And those are stories we need to cover. So we had this really interesting debate where students were actually questioning standards of journalistic objectivity, which is exactly what we wanted them to do. So Alan and I have always taken a very hands-on approach. You know, it's very easy to sit and talk about race, but design a story and talk about why you did what you did. And that's a really good way to make people stop and think about their own identity and think about their own positionality in a way that doesn't make them necessarily feel like they're being pushed in a corner or that they're somehow called out for something. So this was, and we had students talk to us later about how much they loved it and it made them think, and they just couldn't stop thinking about that one discussion. So, and like Alan said, we're replicating this again for Media Literacy Week. So in a virtual format. So we're very excited to see how that's going to turn out.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful idea. It sounds like a rich assignment, rich in-class project. Kimberly, how would you say? Give me an example of something you've done to incorporate this topic into your educational settings.
So if I'm talking specifically about the issues of colorism, what I would say is I have students doing their own versions of autoethnography, where they have to explore in a deep fashion the role of colorism in their lives. Like, where were the messages coming from that help craft what they think about their skin hue now? And so it gives them the chance to really look at families. It gives them the chance to, of course, look at media and what they ingested from those sources, and then also peers. Like, what were the messages that they were receiving from others that helped to construct how they think about their particular skin hue, whether it is one of privilege or one in which they feel like they were denigrated for and had to, you know, take a very firm stance of always on the defense of how they spoke about their particular skin hue. But if we're talking broadly about media literacy and just exploring issues of race, the other things that I have had students do are maintain media diaries for a week in terms of what they're choosing to watch, and then giving them a list of prompts in which they have to respond to take note of the instances of race that come up, and what do those stories look like? What are those stories about? Are there images associated with those stories? And what do those images help convey about the story for them? And then I would also say one of the exercises that I've always enjoyed doing, similar to what Alan and Judith were referring to, is having students do a news analysis where they do take one particular news story, but they also look at that story from the different, from several different media sources, so that they can see how they're talking about the same issue in varied ways, which gives you some insight of how race is being played or used in those sources, or the fact that race doesn't come up raises questions too, especially if it is one of race. One that I think stands out the most to me is when I had students do a similar news analysis on the coverage of Hurricane Katrina. We saw so many very poignant examples of how race was used around issues of looting versus being able to take and defend yourself and support yourself in this very trying time. And the bodies that were represented in those two categories look very different from each other. And so having students to come to that realization of how race gets used in very implicit and explicit ways helps to reveal to them just how pervasive these images, representations, and certainly the stereotypes become in their daily life.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kimberly. Wendy, how about yourself? Give me an example of how you've incorporated critical race media literacy into your classroom settings.
So I ask my students for their final essay in both the communication theory courses that I teach and in the communication research methods courses that I teach to do analyses of various SNL sketches. And because I use SNL sketches so often in the classroom, I'm like, you all know how to do this, so here's your prompt, and I asked them to identify the dominant and elite groups. So think about power and powerlessness, think about intersecting and marginalized identities, and describe in actual terms what the particular race identities are, what the particular gendered identities are, what particular sexualities are recognized, what particular social classes are recognized. Then they're supposed to think about and identify the institutions that are working to maintain hegemony, and institutions and notes of ideology that exist in the SNL sketches. And then finally, I asked them to think about what the takeaways are supposed to be, what the correctives are. And it's like, it's not just that it's funny. What is this supposed to ask us to do? The sketch that I just taught this week when I taught about Burke and the dramatistic pentad, this SNL ornament on the back of the tree, had a number of characters. There was the Matt Damon Good Will Hunting ornament. Kenan Thompson was a greeting from Cleveland ornament who had been bought at a Hudson News airport. There was Rudy Giuliani. And I said, what is the corrective that we take from what goes on the back of the tree and what these ornaments are telling us in terms of the intersecting moments of things that were happening in December of 2018? This was, the post the 2018 midterm elections. This was after Me Too was really active. This was a moment for Black Lives Matter. This is, there's all of these things that are happening. And I said, what's the corrective? And it's that sometimes we hold on to things that we should be letting go of. Racism, sexism, all of these moments that really, really bring us down, we're sentimental about in really problematic ways. And if we actually recognize that that's what this is about, it's not nearly as funny as it seems. It's actually quite sad. And so that's what I asked them to do, is think about all the ways that these things that they think are funny, that are really easy to laugh about, actually are much deeper.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Gordon, how about yourself? Tell us how have you incorporated this topic into your classroom settings?
Absolutely. I already talked about the digital video project. I want to talk actually a little bit more about that community I work in. It's a learning community where the students are in an ESL program, an intensive ESL program, and they have a full year to work. And one of the things that we do in that, in addition to the digital storytelling, where they can use the digital stories to replicate an essay, we also have them sort of take the role of a news person in the media, whoever that would be, and take a story, for example. And I must say, before I tell what the exercise is, we're in a community usually with a sociologist and a community health expert, and those are the other classes that they would take, right? So they're already learning about things like intersectionality, right? Mental, spiritual, emotional health, and the toll that things like racism, sexism, homophobia have on those things. So what we ask them to do is then to sort of highlight a story in the news. That becomes their first part of the term project, where they then have to take the role of like retelling that story in a way that sort of makes all the things that were hidden in the original version of the story clear. For instance, the things that in the story that would be hidden, is it a story about race? Is it a story about sex and sexism? Right? Is it a combination of those things, and how do those things interact with each other? Right? So a lot of times they'll come to us and they'll say, well, the story is the story. It's already told. So we'll work in groups, where we'll have them work in groups with their peers and sort of have them tease out what are the hidden meanings? What are the things that aren't being spoken about? One woman really in our class struggled with a story about, it sounds like there's a car accident outside, sorry. Struggled with a story about domestic violence, but really when she got into it and really pulled a lot out of it, it was really about social class and race and the immigrant experience, and she came to this realization of, wow, this woman in the story who I felt I couldn't be further from who I am, is like, this is me, but in a different context with different choices at my disposal. So some of these moments are really, really powerful, and it's really the students doing the work, and it's really them coaching each other along. I know I said before inoculation, it made it sound like I'm doing all the sort of taking the message and putting it in the students, but really we use a lot of a peer approach where the students themselves are fostering and sort of helping each other reach these realizations, which is a really rich thing to see.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Gordon. And to your point, the word inoculation caused some concern for one of our audience members. Not concern, but I think it's, let's see, I'm looking at Teresa Redmond, I think. Hang on one second. And the question was posed, I struggle with the word inoculate. It feels passive. How might this idea be reframed to position youth as active in identifying oppressive narratives and or the ways media commodify them? I don't know, Gordon, if you wanted to address that, or any of the panelists, like inoculate versus empower. Are audience members simply just being receptive or sponges, virtual sponges, taking in everything, or are they active? Is there some sort of active consumption going on?
I think that was an amazing question. I think kudos for an amazing question. I think totally valid point. You know, I say something off the spur as I'm thinking through the coronavirus epidemic that we've been plunged back into here in the city. Totally valid point. It makes it sound like it's a banking model of education, you know, where the professor, all-knowing professor, we're, you know, inoculating the student, but really it's more like something like herd mentality, like where we're all sort of engaging in this group sort of mutual defense, where we're sort of teasing out together things that are going to help us move through the world in better ways and be more resistant, or not more resistant, be better able to sort of pick out and dissect the things that seek to infect us. You know, so really it's a, you know, there's no linear sort of influence going on. It's really like a group influence that's, you know, multi-directional. And like, I gain so much from the students, and the students gain so much from each other. The students are each other's best coaches, really.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Would anyone else on the panel care to address that, the concept of inoculation? Let's see. So we've got a couple of other questions. Let me get to those because we are running a little short on time. Journalism, and this is from Melissa Green Bly. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. Journalism is struggling to find the best path forward to regain audience trust in light of quote unquote fake news, of the fake news moment. Many journalism scholars and journalists recognize the false narrative of objectivity, yes, but still struggle to embrace social justice journalism, which has a clear advocacy perspective. What do you think is the role of journalism in this moment? What obligations do journalists have as far as contributing to improving the public discourse? I think this is a wonderful question. Maybe Alan and Judith might want to take this.
It's funny because Alan and I will debate over this because I'll be like, but you can report on the truth. And he'll go, no, you can't. So I think I'll let him speak on the why you can't.
Well, whose truth?
Right. There we go.
Who are the arbiters of truth? I don't know. Can we just like blow up this whole notion of objectivity in journalism? Like,
hello.
None of us understand it. None of us understand. And then
Yeah,
use it as
it has been, right?
attack. It's so easy to use it as a point of attack when against credible journalism.
Yes.
We all come with our own experiences, our own subjectivity to these stories, both as producers of news and readers of news as well. I mean, I just don't know what the benefit of continuing this canard of objectivity is.
Yeah.
Especially and it's like in journalism programs, it's like, I mean, it's sacrosanct. Yet I just don't. I don't know the answers. I don't know what the thing is, unless it's more just journalists telling us what their position is, what their positionality is, what experiences they bring to these stories, why they made the choices they do, like letting us in on the process, like helping us develop our media literacy skills as they're developing theirs as well. I don't know. It's like it should be more of an exchange.
Yeah.
As scholars, we have to acknowledge our positionality, especially when we do qualitative research, right? So maybe it's time journalists start doing that too.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, I realized Wendy had her hand up before I opened her mouth.
No, it's wonderful because you're giving me you're giving my answer, which is we need. I believe deeply in every journalism class that I teach that journalists need to understand. Students of journalism and journalists need to understand that their work is ideologically based. That they, as an institution, are about conjuring and replicating ideology. And so much of journalism education is not about that. It follows from this, if you track the history of journalism in the United States, it goes back to the Enlightenment and back to industrialization. And there's deep economic threads and deep reasons that journalists uphold an idea of objectivity. And if you ask a journalist, why do you say talk to the police officer instead of talk to the family member at the moment of the crime or at the place, the event. And they'll say, well, because the police officer like knows what's going on. Right? But really what they mean when they really get down to it is because the police officer is accessible to me, because the police officer has a kind of fact that I can not have to take much responsibility for, but go back and report in a kind of process as I adhere to this routinized behavior. You know, it's all of that boundary work of journalism, and journalists have these complex roles, and I constantly struggle with when objectivity is out. And yet so many people who are journalists and who do sort of basic journalism skills training want objectivity because it is the closest thing to a math-like kind of process that journalists can be taught. Do this, not that. Talk to these people. Get the story out. Adhere to immediacy. Adhere to this particular kind of routine story, and then you're kind of absolved of the repercussions, of the consequences of all the people that you leave out, right? Because the owner can pay the bills. And if we don't offer and ask and demand that both journalism as an institution and journalism as an educational mission and journalism as a practice recognize all of those ideological and economic pressures that journalists face, we can't really challenge objectivity, or we just keep letting it be part of the conversation.
Sure. And Wendy, I agree. Yes, someone else wanted to wait.
It's Kimberly. I just wanted to make one comment, and maybe this is my, glimmer of hope. But to the original question that the colleague posed in the thread, I think we are in this perfect storm in terms of what's happening with a public health crisis, what's happening in terms of the civil unrest throughout the nation, and certainly even the very chaotic political scene that we're in the midst of. All of those represent a perfect storm for us to do some of what Alan talked about, to just blow up this whole notion of objectivity and to allow us to engage more in doing journalism in a way that is more inclusive and does really do the work of giving a full story instead of just aspects of a story. And so to Wendy's point, the example about using the police officer versus the family member that might be involved in an incident, we do that because we have already as a society decided that the police officer is this recognized mode of knowledge that we respect and that we've already embraced. And so we can go to that person and hopefully entrust and trust, believing in what it is that they have conveyed to us, when in fact we know that they are another human being with a series of biases and perspectives that they have come to the table with. And so clearly it is impossible for them to be able to offer that level of objectivity. So this perfect storm that we're in right now could be a glimmer of hope for journalism to shift its ways.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. We could talk about that particular question all day, but I want to answer one more question before we leave in the time that we have, and it's from Key White. Thank you for this excellent panel. When teaching predominantly white student groups, do you ever parallel the critical race theory and other critical theories such as indigenous and decolonial theories, or even critical whiteness studies? I'm curious how to bridge critical media literacy to self-awareness and the possibility of changed belief, behavior, and action. Critical race theory is obviously central to media activism, but I'm grappling with ways to engage students with deep questions of dominance and privilege within their own epistemological and ontological sensibilities. How do we go beyond the critical to the transformed? I think that's a great question, good question to end on. How do we go from critical examination to transformation? What do we think as a panel?
Jayne, this is Kimberly again. I will answer very shortly and say that I don't see us being able to transform within a class period. I think it's similar to the old inoculation theory of media, where I am tasked with being able to plant a seed that hopefully students continue to carry on and have experiences that then lead them back to reflect on what they learned or gained in a course with me, so that they can then continue their own evolution around being more media literate. I don't think it's possible to do this 180 or this massive transformation. I do think it's about planting seeds.
Yes, wonderful, wonderful. How about other panelists? How would you answer this question in the one moment we have to respond?
Jayne, this is Wendy, and I so hear and absolutely echo what Kimberly has just said. It's about incrementalism, getting one moment of change to bring about another moment of change, to bring about another moment of change, and that is truly the best of the liberal arts, the best of the university experience, where something that they learn in one moment of a class carries through. So I love what Kimberly said.
Yes, yes, yes. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I believe we are just out of time, and so it's unfortunate. I'm trying to copy and paste the other answers because we want to get them answered even as a private panel. We can just sort of send them to you via email so that your concerns or your issues, or at least your questions, are addressed. But thank everyone for coming to take part in this wonderful discussion. This is something that we need to have more discussion on, so I'm looking forward to increased discussions. We have an edited volume coming out that will be published on this particular topic next year. And I also have a book on news literacy that's coming out also next year. And the salient themes that were talked about today regarding journalism and lack of objectivity, and the connection and merger into how news education or journalism education is actualized in this country, those are central themes for the book. So look for those coming out next year. And thank you all for even joining us and for agreeing to take part in this wonderful discussion. Nice afternoon and evening to everyone assembled. Thank you.
So if everyone can unmute and just give thanks and applause, it'd be wonderful.
Thanks so much, Jayne. Thanks so much.
You're quite welcome. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. And thank you, special thank you, warm thank you to my panelists. You all are wonderful. Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much.
Y'all are amazing.
Thank you, thank you.
Fabulous. In 30 minutes, we'll have the next session.
Congratulations.
You can stay on for a little while if you want to still talk. That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, thank you.
Great job,
Thanks,
Jayne.
Yeah, this was lovely.
Great session.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure to be able to meet all of you and to hear your wonderful views. And thank you to all the people who weighed in on the chat. I mean, we can still kind of, if we have 30 minutes, we can sort of do like a post after panel kind of thing. Keep it going if you all don't mind. I'm definitely receptive to that.
Wendy, are you at work?
I can actually give you maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then I'm going to need to open up for another group.
Understood.
Go
all
ahead.
Right, so we'll take 10. We'll take 10 minutes if anyone wants to weigh in.
Well, Jayne, I wanted to say, and this is to all the panelists, though, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of the group. I'm so glad that I had the chance to meet all of you and certainly learn from you in terms of some of the interesting work that you're doing. And I'm certainly hoping we have other opportunities to engage like this.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful. Yes.
Yeah, the conversation that was happening in the chat was so rich. I wish we.
I know. There's so much going on there.
Totally it was. I was just like, oh my goodness, we have so much to talk about in so little time.
Yeah.
The journalism topic is just very close to my heart. I mean, the idea that we can't even begin to explore these topics in journalism until we come full center to the realization that journalism has been hijacked. It is a media process. It is a business. It is a business. And even the people who are actors in that construct are not in control of the process. They are sent out, they are given assignments, they are given edicts and mandates that are central to the business and advertising function of the process of journalism. So our need for information has been hijacked by business interests. So we're all sort of caught in this dystopic kind of experience of like, wait, I need to know information, but it appears that the information isn't really what I need. It's sort of like, wait, what is this?
Yeah, it's so true, Jayne. Like I begin, every journalism class with a lecture about the history of journalism, and journalism in the United States began with people printing wedding and birth announcements. It was printing businesses. They were not people who were interested in anything beyond making money, and then they figured out that they could expand their audience by wrapping bigger news around small little ads. And I'm so sorry, I've got to run, but this has just been lovely, and I really appreciate this opportunity for connection. So
you're quite welcome. Care. So nice seeing you, Wendy. Take care.
Goodbye.
It's such a great point that she makes about it being a business, because this morning I did a panel at another conference that was on the East Coast, and I was talking about bloggers, and it's amazing. One of the things that bloggers do not want to talk about is how much of a business citizen journalism really is. It just seems like it's this democratic practice or practice of identity, but it's really like a very lucrative business, and it's one of the most heavily guarded secrets. Folks will not talk about how much they make from their sites or their blogs.
No, but Jayne, I was listening to your conversation about the whole why journalism doesn't talk about critical media literacy.
Okay.
And I think we need to go back full circle. And I'm kind of thinking right now, the article about Jordan Billings, what is critical race theory, and what is it doing in a nice field like education? And it seems that now we have to start thinking, why aren't the other fields talking about this? It's like, kind of like, it seems that we're at a point that, the conversation on any critical theory, anything is education. Like, half of critical theory did not start in education. Critical race theory did not begin in education. It started in law. Why? So, and I think that even the conversation of why aren't journalists talking about critical media literacy, that's a big question. Yeah. Why do we only talk about critical media literacy in like language arts or in second language education? Why are we not talking about that in journalism? Why are we not having that conversation? Why don't we, kind of like paraphrasing Roundtable Discussion, and I'm just being incredibly brazen here. It's like, why don't we take critical theory to those other nice fields that are not talking about it anymore?
Well, to answer your question, Raul, I think that's a wonderful question and so apt once again. And I just want to make a statement that is racism and white supremacy are conducted through education, media, law, all of the structures of society, not to evoke Marx per se, but the structures of society, every element. And so when you ask, why aren't we talking about critical race, critical any analysis, is because these systems are designed to create a certain class of people who don't.
The system isn't broken. As I say, the system isn't broken. The system is working quite well.
Absolutely. It's a train running on automatic.
No, it's not running late.
Not good for business. Not good for business.
Oh, yeah.
Yourself, right?
Absolutely. This has been wonderful.
Great battle. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Jayne.
Thank you all. You're quite welcome. Thank you for joining us. Yes, enjoy the rest of your week.
Judith, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Alan.
Judith and Alan. Gordon, thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Kimberly, where'd she go?